Hello friends, welcome to this session on principles of pharmacotherapeutics. I'm Dr. Nirmala Rege and I'm Professor Emeritus in Department of Pharmacology and Therapeutics at GS Medical College and KM Hospital, Mumbai. And currently I'm Professor in Department of Pharmacology at IRAS Lucknow Medical College. And these are some of my other affiliations. I congratulate you that you have chosen medicine as a discipline and now you have entered second MBBS. I'm sure all of you must be aspiring to become physicians or surgeons and not pharmacologists like me. And there may be many branches, as you know. If you become physician, you can start practicing family physician after your graduation, but you can do specialization as well. Remember, as a physician, you will be prescribing drugs to many people, your patients. And as a surgeon too, you will be giving like surgery, gynecology, orthopedics, the ENT, ophthalmology. Though you will be performing operations, you will be still prescribing the drug. So once you are in medicine as a discipline, that any branch of medicine, drugs form the integral part. Currently, as a second MBBS students, you are learning pharmacology. And I'm sure your teachers have given you the definition of pharmacology. And it is a branch which provides scientific data about how the drugs act and what are the different formulations, routes, doses, the frequency, duration, what adverse effect they have got, and also how to use them safely, what are the indications and contraindications. But I'm sure most of you are also wondering, when you are visiting the wards, how I'm going to apply this knowledge actually in practice. And there is a branch in medicine which is called as therapeutics. And this branch is concerned with the concerned with the prevention and cure of disease or relief of symptoms with drug therapy as well as non-drug measures. So there is drugs are used in therapeutics. And this use of drugs in clinical practice, it's termed as pharmacotherapeutics. And both therapeutics is a applied science and so also the pharmacotherapeutics. Now, when we say it is an applied science, it definitely requires a scientific knowledge. But along with scientific knowledge, it requires certain skills, and we call them as a prescribing skills. It also requires a wisdom on the part of the doctor and a lot of sense of responsibility because you are making decisions on behalf of your patients. And therefore, pharmacotherapeutics is not merely a science, it is a science as well as art. And why it becomes art? Your patient, it's not the same all the time. They may be coming with the same disease, but the background information can be different. So each one of them is different and you are making the use of this scientific knowledge for that individual one. So I would like to suggest to you that definitely you will be having your short-term goal as passing second MBBS in pharmacology and going ahead with that. But don't keep only that as a goal. Keep your eyes on the long-term goal which you have to achieve at the end of your graduation, and that you are going to become a competent clinician. And when you want to become a competent clinician, when you are studying pharmacology in the second MBBS, and when you are visiting the wards, clinical ward, or the OPDs, just try to see how pharmacology is getting applied in practice by your senior clinicians, teachers, and try to analyze that so that you get acquainted with the pharmacotherapeutics. Now, there is a competency in pharmacology curriculum as well, that the principles of pharmacotherapeutics. And therefore, my agenda today is to get you acquainted with these principles of pharmacotherapeutics so that whenever you are visiting the ward, even if you keep them in mind, you will be able to see that what is being done and you will be able to analyze yourself. And all of you are doing self-directive learning in some subject. So do it as a self-directive learning. All clinicians are concerned about which drug to be used, whether their desirable effects will be getting exerted as there in the textbook, or there may be some alteration, whether there will be some undesirable effect, noxious effect, what will happen on the continuation of drug therapy. They are also are interested in what should be the dose so that I can see the relationship between the dose and the response. When should I start it? What route? And how much of frequency? How to step up? So what should be the duration? And everything is not available in textbook as well. They are also worried about the special population. You get the pregnant women, you get people with organ dysfunction, you get children and elderly, adolescent, and there could be n number of comorbid conditions. So how to use the drugs? And then whether we can recognize the adverse drug reaction and whether we can manage them effectively. And there could be variations in the drug response based on habits, based on concomitant drugs the patient is taking, as well as the diet. So all these things are coming up again and again in clinicians' mind whenever they are looking at the patient, examining the patient, and prescribing their drug. So the first and foremost principle in pharmacotherapeutics is establish your goal for therapy. And I'm sure your teachers must have told you it could be curative, symptomatic, preventive, palliative, diagnostic. But all those things will depend ultimately on the accurate diagnosis and right indication. And therefore, I urge you, please take interest in the history taking as well as in the clinical examination. So history taking is extremely important, and it is not just to establish the diagnosis of the patient, that is definitely needed, but when we are talking about the goal for therapy, you have to take the history of previous medication the person may have taken. You can take the personal history, even the socio-economic status of that person, whether the person will afford that drug what you are prescribing. So all these lateral aspects, whether he is getting stressed or whether there is an anxiety. So you have to not just when you are practicing therapeutic, as I told you, it can't be just pharmacotherapeutics. You have to use the other things as well. So for using the drug, you definitely require what the drugs will do. Always treat the patient as a whole and not the symptom. That should be the rule. And I will give you an example that whenever you detect the arrhythmia, you don't have to rush to treat that. And for asymptomatic treatment, you should not treat them. Or you should give antiarrhythmics only if the clear benefits are seen. So what are the clear benefits? For example, you are using beta blockers in myocardial infarction. Then it has been shown that there is a decrease in mortality and there is a decrease in symptoms. So the patient has to be symptomatic. And I will give you an experience of a trial which was done, and that trial is very well known in literature, which is called as CAST trial. And CAST trial means cardiac arrhythmia suppression trial. And what was done in that? The patient with the recent history of myocardial infarction were given these three drugs. And these drugs, you must be knowing that these three drugs, they belong to a particular group, and that group is the class 1C agents. And you will, I understand that all of you have not done all the things in pharmacology. You are at different levels because in different colleges, different topics have been considered. But these are the agents which belong to this class 1C. And why they were given? They were given to suppress the asymptomatic ventricular premature depolarization, because ventricular premature depolarization can increase the sudden cardiac death. And therefore, the results of this study actually shown something different. There was a 2 to 3-fold increase was found in the death. And during the continuation of this study with the drug morisizin, which was one of them, the incidence was more. Later on, the meta-analysis of studies done with these class 1 drugs and the quinidine, procainamide, diazopyramide, they also belong to this class 1. And they were also found to increase the risk of sudden cardiac death. And therefore, our learning from this study was that asymptomatic ventricular premature depolarization should not be treated. Now, this learning has come to a very bitter experience. So, you have to think yourself, if the patient is asymptomatic, is your treatment going to make a difference? Similarly, you don't have to prescribe pill for every ill, and that is a second principle. And you can see this example, which I've given over here, that a 50-year-old housewife reported with following symptoms: headache in the evening, palpitation in the morning, indigestion, especially after heavy meals, bloated feeling in the abdomen after menstrual period. But after examination and investigation, so lots of symptoms were there on history. But on examination and indigestion, no abnormality was detected, except there was a mild obesity. But see what doctor has prescribed. Doctor has prescribed paracetamol, prescribed atenolol, prescribed unienzyme, prescribed furosemide, and also given vitamin E. And can you relate that to the symptom? So for each and every symptom, the doctor has prescribed the drug. And that is not a rational therapy. You don't require it. Probably this particular lady will not require any drug therapy. Mere change in lifestyle and some exercises may settle her down, and some changes in her diet. But no need for to give the drug. But the doctor has, the prescribing physician has not done the same. So unnecessarily, the patient is exposed to so many drugs, and remember, with every drug comes a baggage of its adverse effect. Uh, so you have to ask yourself, is drug therapy required? And this is just a cartoon for you. Like the surgeon is telling the person, and now my mother, Mrs. Nebel, will put you to sleep with tales of her arthritis, which merely say that you require anesthesia. But there are certain techniques that will help you, not in this particular condition, it is just a joke, but you have to think of the other non-therapeutic measures, non-pharmacological measures when you are treating your patient. The third important principle, and this is really an important principle, that prescribe rationally and not fashionably. The fashionable prescription is the one where you are giving the drugs unnecessarily, where you are giving the drugs without evidence, and sometimes some new drugs come into market, so you will feel that how can you not prescribe that particular drug? All my friends are prescribing and I must prescribe. Your teachers in pharmacology will tell you a very, very important criteria, which they may have told you already, for rational use of medicine. And we call this as STEP criteria. And what that STEP stands for, the S stands for safety. T stands for tolerability or suitability, whether the drug is to be given to that particular patient, whether that patient is pregnant, whether that there are some comorbidity, whether the patient can tolerate that, or whether the patient is elderly. What is the efficacy of that particular drug? And then what is the price? What is the cost? Whether the person is going to afford it or not. Giving ACE inhibitors to a maid servant working in your home, whether she will be able to afford the ACE inhibitor, you have to think it, or whether you will like to go for the diuretics. So that is the thing which you will have to see. I forgot to tell you that you can put your questions, whatever come to your mind, in the question and answer box. There is no chat available for you. So go on keeping it, and at the end of this talk, I will deal with those questions. Okay. So I will request all of you to download this book by WHO. It is freely available on the internet. It is guide to good prescribing. And whatever I was telling you, it is given very explicitly in this particular book. So it's a very small book, not almost 100 pages or so, but worth reading this particular book if you want to become a good prescriber. One more thing you have to remember, that what is pharmacology ultimately? That whatever the pathological changes have occurred, we try to bring it through pharmacology back to normality, that is to the physiology. Sometimes it is very easy, like in Parkinsonism, when there is a dopamine depletion, you give L-Dopa. Or hypothyroidism, there is a thyroxine deficiency, you give thyroxine. Sometimes it is tricky as well. Now, in case of acute adrenal insufficiency, naturally you will give the steroids, and the steroid which is selected is hydrocortisone hemisuccinate. But why this particular 100 milligram 4 times a day dose? Why we have to use that particular dose? And if you go through this literature or in your textbook, you will find that after 4th or 5th day onwards, hydrocortisone can be given orally in maintenance dose. And that dose is also given over there, 25 to 30 milligrams. Why this particular dose has to be given? Why not give 100 milligram orally? And it has to be given along with 9-alpha fludrocortisone, that is the fluorohydrocortisone. Why you can give me the rationale why the maintenance dose is combined with the fluorohydrocortisone? Because if the adrenal cortex is fired, naturally the mineralocorticoid have to be given along with the glucocorticoid. Then in the initial period, when we are giving the glucocorticoid like hydroxycortisone, why we are not combining it with the hydrocortisone? Why only when the dose is decreased we are giving this particular dose? And all these things is the pharmacotherapy. That understanding why a particular dose is given, why it is given for 4 to 6 hourly and not just a single injection, why that mineralocorticoid is to be given with the maintenance dose. And I'm not going to tell you these answers, but you have to find it from your own textbook and see whether it is getting applied in practice. Sometimes you may be having a very complex pathophysiology, like this is a pathophysiology of heart failure, congestive heart failure. Now, you will see that wherever I have put as 1, 2, 3, 4, those things, that those numbers, they are the different drugs. I'm not labeling the drugs because I don't know whether you have this particular topic has been covered in your class. But remember, this particular condition requires more number of drugs. And in that case, how you are going to institute the therapy, what will be the order is very, very important. And you can go back and you can, when this topic is done, you can think over, why not we start with a diuretics? Because can you see over here, there is a sodium retention. And whenever there is a sodium retention, that can you see here that you require to give the diuretics. Now, why we don't start the therapy with diuretics alone? And this you will have to find out later on. But this can be the condition, and every time you have to ask yourself, why this is particular thing is not done. You must have been taught, I'm sure, that autonomic nervous system must have got covered, and you must be knowing that there are different types of alpha receptors, and alpha 1 and alpha 2, and there are drugs which are selective. So the drug like phenoxybenzamine, which is a non-selective, acts on alpha 1 and alpha 2, and that later on we got the selective alpha 1 agonist like prazosin, and now we have got the more selective one that they are act on the alpha 1A and 1D, and that is tamsulosin. If you look at their uses, then phenoxybenzamine is used in pheochromocytoma. We don't prefer prazosin. Only when now 3 brands of phenoxybenzamine are available. Previously, that those were not available for some time. Then people have used prazosin. But why that is so? Why a drug which is non-selective at alpha 1 and alpha 2 is preferred for pheochromocytoma, and not a drug which is selective for alpha-1. And where the alpha-1 receptors are situated, they are situated on the vessels. And the primary role of these alpha-1 receptors is the vasoconstriction. So when you give this drug, there is a vasodilatation. So what is the difference in the vasodilatation achieved by prazosin versus that of phenoxybenzone? If you go through the uses of prazosin, it is used for hypertension, benign prostatic hyperplasia, also for the scorpion sting. Now, it has been found that while treating that benign prostatic hyperplasia was not initially the indication. It came later on. It emerged later on when people were studying the antihypertensive effect. It was found some of the patients with benign hyperplasia, they responded to prostate size decrease. And that's why the prazosin has that particular indication. And that later on led to this tamsulosin. So tamsulosin, that it was found that alpha-1A receptors are present on the internal sphincter of the bladder. And that because this is an antagonist, it will reduce the tone of the smooth muscles and that will reduce the resistance to the urinary outflow. So when you will give tamsulosin and when you will give prazosin, naturally it is obvious if the patient has got hypertension and benign prostatic hyperplasia, you will go for prazosin. But if the patient has got only benign prostatic hyperplasia, no hypertension, then you will prefer tamsulosin, because if you give prazosin, then in this particular patient, the blood pressure may drop and that may be dangerous for that particular patient. So one has to apply the knowledge of this receptor into therapy. When you read this particular case scenario, a 65-year-old male was diagnosed to have a benign prostatic hyperplasia few months ago, and then the surgeon offered him bladder training, fluid intake, lifestyle modifications. The surgeon also used initially the non-pharmacological measures. But then of late, because the symptoms deteriorated, the enlargement was seen and the size was less than 3 centimeters, surgeon prescribed tamsulosin. Now you will understand, looking at the receptors and what our discussion was, why tamsulosin was given. I will go a little further. After 6 months, the patient comes for follow-up and there is a worsening of urinary symptom. Now the prostate size has enlarged and PSA levels have increased. And now the surgeon gives finasteride. Why did he prescribe finasteride at this particular junction? When you understand the pathophysiology of the benign prostatic hyperplasia, you will understand that this first diagram, you will see that there is a normal prostate and you can see the urine flow. In case of second diagram, you will see that the prostate had enlarged, and because the prostate had enlarged, there is an obstruction to the urine flow. And this is because of that, this is a dynamic component, because there is an increased tone of contraction of the smooth muscle within the prostate, which is alpha-1 mediated, which we have studied just now. And that's where the tamsulosin can be given. But in case of, there is a static component. And why the prostatic enlargement takes place? Because the testosterone gets converted to dihydrotestosterone, which stimulates the androgen receptor, and that leads to the prostatic enlargement. And this conversion occurs under the 5-alpha reductase enzyme. So if you give finasteride, which is a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, then you will take care of this static component. So now the surgeon has given taking care of that dynamic component as well as static component. What all these examples, what I have given you for the heart failure, for the benign prostatic, this thing, or the earlier steroid, they indicate that you have to integrate the drug information with relevant knowledge from the other subjects. You can't just have the your pharmacology separately and not look at the pathology or physiology. If you go back to physiology in case of steroid, how much of the steroid gets generated in the body per day, you may get, especially under the stress and acute adrenal insufficiency is a stress, you will get perhaps the answer for why we are giving 100 milligram 4 to 6 times a day. You will understand that what is the activity of hydrocortisone at such a large dose on the sodium retention as well as its own effect of glucocorticoid effects. So that you have to understand. You at the same time, like pathology, you have to understand how that benign hyperplasia is taking place and what are the components. And then the medicine part of it, that how the surgeon, the person is going to come to that surgeon and how to deal with that. So all this, or whether, as I told you for prazosin, whether there was a hypertension alone or whether there is a hypertension with benign prostatic enlargement or only the BPH, that the medicine person will. But integration of all these things, the other subject will help you in therapeutic. And therefore, can you see that spiral at one side, that on the right side? And that what that spiral tells you, that when you are going from first year to second year to third, fourth year of your medicine, every time try to go back and look at what you have learned previously. You can't study a subject in isolation. The fifth principle is self-prescribing at all times. And you may be knowing that any textbook you will open, that there is a big list of adverse drug reaction. And whenever we ask people, means our students in exam, what is the adverse reaction of that drug? The answer is nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. This is a one. But you have to remember that rather than memorizing the entire list, think about which are the common adverse drug reactions the person is going to have. Because this common adverse drug reaction, if you remember that, you will be able to tell that person whether he can tolerate that for some time. Many a times tolerance develop to this adverse drug reaction. So then he may not feel it later on. So whether he should do that or whether he should receive any treatment for that, or whether he has to come back because he is not, that those reactions are becoming more severe. Whereas the serious one, you have to tell the patients also, and you have to realize you have to give that patient priority. And you have to see that patient immediately. The drug may have to be stopped and may have to be substituted by another one, and you have to treat the serious reaction as well. So remember to segregate the reaction into common reactions and the serious reactions. I will give you an example of opioids for cancer patients. We use this drug quite often for cancer patients. And we generally otherwise don't use opioids in practice for just for the other pain like headache and all. So there is, what happens in cancer patient, or for that matter for any patient, the adverse drug reactions, the tolerance develops, which is desirable. So tolerance develops to respiratory depression, confusion, sedation, nausea, which is predictable. And when you are giving it consistently, after 5 to 7 days time, you are giving the tolerance develop. But for the analgesia, tolerance is a seldom problem in case of clinical setting. So when you are giving it to the cancer patient to alleviate the pain, especially in the palliative therapy, most of the patients, they remain stabilized on the particular dose for a longer time. And when they require more dose, it typically occurs when the condition worsens. So tolerance doesn't develop to analgesia. And tolerance also doesn't develop to the constipation. So you have to remember that many a times these patients who are receiving opioid, they may require stimulating laxative at regular, if you are going to give the opioids. So this is to be remembered for the opioids, and one should not, just because opioids cause addiction, but that is what we read it from our textbook, you should not report that from the patient who really need the opioids. It is difficult sometimes to recognize the adverse drug reaction. Means if you see a patient with a pitching edema, you don't know whether it is a side effect or the adverse effect of the drug. which is causing some venous congestion, like our nifedipine can cause pitting edema, or whether it is something which is the patient is having going into the heart failure or the renal problems. So one has to then may simulate the clinical condition. And sometimes they are preventable also. And your teachers will definitely, this is a very classical example we say, that when you are prescribing phenytoin, the gingival hyperplasia can be prevented if you keep the mouth hygiene properly. So you have to give the patient, educate the patient as well. I'm sure all of you must have covered this pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. These are the early lectures in your course. And you must be knowing that this pharmacoconcentration in the plasma is very, very important. And that is the, depending upon the concentration in plasma, the effects will be observed. What as a physician you can do, you don't have the control on the pharmacodynamics, how the drug will act and how the adverse reactions will occur. But you can definitely have an active influence on the pharmacokinetics. You can modulate the pharmacokinetics depending on what quantity you are administering drug, what dosage form, how often you are giving the drug, for how long it will take to reach that the plasma required plasma concentration, how you can maintain the plasma concentration. So concentrate on the pharmacokinetics. Whenever we give the drug, with every dose there is an accumulation, and the drug reaches a particular state. We call it as a steady state, and I'm sure this also must have been told to you by your teachers. Now, while reaching the steady state, the drug crosses that therapeutic threshold. That is the therapeutic threshold is that plasma concentration which is required to see the effect. So, and if later on, if you are not giving the drugs properly and you are not you go on increasing the amount, then it may cross the upper level, which is we are calling as the therapeutic ceiling. And what is therapeutic ceiling? That is the one, the plasma concentration where your drug is causing maximally tolerated adverse effects. So if you cross that therapeutic ceiling, then there may be unacceptable adverse or the severe adverse reactions now. So our aim as a physician is to maintain it between a therapeutic threshold and therapeutic ceiling. And this distance is called as therapeutic window. So when we say the drug with narrow therapeutic index, these are the ones where that therapeutic threshold and therapeutic ceiling are very close to each other. So slight increase in the dose you can reach into the go into the toxicity. Most of the drug, this is quite wide and you can add safely. When you are giving the same dose of the drug at a required time interval, which remains constant, it goes on slowly accumulating and then you will reach the steady state. So that profile of how that curve will be depends upon the pharmacokinetic factors, depends upon the absorption, distribution, how much drug is getting eliminated from the body, getting metabolized and eliminated from the body. Whereas the position and width of these are the pharmacodynamic factors. Again, I'm repeating that you can't modulate the pharmacodynamic factors, but you can modulate the pharmacokinetic factors. And therefore, for the drugs, as I told you, that is narrow therapeutic index, where the for them this window is low, very small or narrow, then like anti-epileptics, or the drugs which show variation across population, like the opioids when we are giving for cancer, the doses may be different, and then sometimes to induce tolerance to the adverse drug reaction, like L-Dopa or Prazosin, what you have to do is the principle is go low, go slow. Start with the low dose and slowly, gradually increase it. You should not increase the dose before 4 half-lives are passed. And why these 4 half-lives are required? Because 4 half-lives of the drug are required to reach the steady state. So let the drug attain the steady state, then you may increase the dose and then the new steady state will come. So check that during this particular period of 4 half-life, see that no unwarranted effects are observed. And this you can manage. How to increase slowly the raising dose. Similarly, for certain drug, you require tapering of the drugs causing tolerance or drug causing rebound symptoms. And these are the certain list of the drugs which you will find in the textbook. So if you suddenly stop it, then there could be the adverse reaction. It could be emergency also, because when you are giving the steroids for a long time and they will suppress the our axis, and there could be patient may land up with acute adrenal insufficiency. Patient for a long time on the beta blockers, they can come immediately with this angina or myocardial infarction. So it could be very, very dangerous. And all this starting the drug, so increasing the dose, tapering the dose, all is related to your pharmacokinetic principle. And that is why you should learn them properly. Prescribing the drug in pregnancy, you have to always think about what is the effect is going to be on the fetus. So that is usually the organ development takes place in the first trimester of a pregnancy. So what is a teratogenic potential? The basic principle is prescribe only if there are expected benefits to the mother are greater than the risk to the fetus, and avoid in the first trimester. Avoid any drugs in the first trimester. Again, challenge remains in the pediatric population and geriatric population. And then because there are so many conditions are there that how to prescribe it is really a big challenge. And that's why we have geriatric OPDs and we have a pediatrician student. Remember, children are not miniature adults. And also remember, the geriatric population, you cannot use the same principles as you are using for the adult patient. Best way is to minimize the number of drugs. Again, go with the principle as go slow, go low. And then prescribe with weight, age, surface area. Use those formulas. No guesstimates should be done. And simplify the drug regimen once or twice a day. May not be always possible for the elderly people because they have multiple conditions to be treated. Take care to talk to the patient and educate the caretaker as well. Because many times patient may say yes, the elderly person may say yes, but he must not have understood it. And monitor for the adverse drug reaction and the compliance frequently. Similarly, for liver and kidney dysfunction, you have to select the drugs which are not getting eliminated from the damaged organ. It appears simply, but if I ask you why you will prefer doxycycline over tetracycline, or why you will prefer oxazepam in liver the patient having cirrhosis rather than the diazepam, or why suppose there is a renal function damage and I want to give only gentamicin because the organisms are sensitive to gentamicin. What should I do? How should I go about it? So all these things you will learn only through applying the knowledge of pharmacology for those drugs. From where they are getting metabolized, what is their amount in the body, how they get controlled during their elimination. All these things you will learn only through the application of pharmacology in practice. There are many comorbid conditions and hypertension with diabetes, very, very common nowadays. So remember, you should always try to use the drug. First, whenever you get a condition, think whether I have a drug which can be indicated in both the condition and go for that particular drug. Like ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers or calcium channel blockers, you can try to use those type of drugs. Beta blockers, you know, that mask the hypoglycemia, or diuretics, they can cause hyperglycemia. So they are not the preferred drug. It is now it has been shown that they are not completely contraindicated. If they are required, you can use them, but with proper monitoring. And in spite of that, even if you apply your knowledge, even if you read have a very sound basis of scientific knowledge, the problems can arise at any stage. And remember and be aware of them. So why they occur? There may be sometimes unexpected adverse drug reaction, like those type B reaction. You must have studied the bizarre reaction. There may be drug-drug interaction. maybe between the two modern medicinal drugs, or it could be the drugs of other systems of medicine. Our patients, and so many times we have seen, because we run Ayurveda Research Center at KEM also, so we have seen the patient has taken modern medicinal drug, sulfonylurea, and also taken something from the Ayurveda. And then there is a sudden fall in the glucose level and patient has landed up with the hypoglycemia. And you must be knowing hypoglycemia is more dangerous than the hyperglycemia. So these things can happen. Drug food interaction, or patient may abruptly discontinue the drug. Patient is on insulin and he feels, no, I have not eaten, I will stop taking insulin. And then come after with hyperglycememia. Or the patient may change the brand because a particular brand is not available. And in our country, even the chemist can prescribe, or chemist can say that you use this particular brand. And such type of thing can happen with the anti-epileptic. So the dangerous it is when the responses are like the patient is having bleeding from some spot, or the hypoglycemia, or there is a hypertensive crisis, or patient comes in the convulsions. You must think of this. If unexpectedly your patients have coming to the hospital with this, you have to treat it. Many a times, this polypharmacy is unavoidable. We teach you not to give multiple drugs, but sometimes you have to if the patient has so many other conditions. But you have to monitor carefully. And don't use the fixed dose combination in that case, because many a times we think that because the patient has to take the multiple drug, and that will decrease its, that was problematic, popping up tablets and the pills again and again. So let's give the fixed dose combination. But remember, if there is you have to increase a particular drug in that fixed dose combination, the particular ingredient, the other ingredient gets automatically, you have to increase it because they are coming at the fixed dose. And therefore, there will be naturally some adverse effect will occur. And sometimes, if some adverse effect occur, you can't pinpoint it. It is because of that X ingredient or it is Y ingredient. So unless the patient is stabilized, don't use the fixed dose combination. And then remember this also, that any unanticipated turn of events in patient course, whether it is accelerated efficacy, like I told you for the Ayurvedic medicine and our sulfonylurea, or the appearance of unusual or untoward effect, has to be considered as a possible consequence of a drug interaction. So keep that in mind, because it is very, very difficult to identify a drug interaction. So you have to assess the risk in that patient. If possible, suppose there are adverse conditions, you measure the risk and just the acceptability. You can see that what are the needs met by the drug you have prescribed, whether there are any alternatives, whether there are any antidotes available, and educate the patient also. So you have to know your science, but you should be capable of assessing the situation, identifying the option, analyzing the option, and then taking the action. So all these things you will learn when you are using the pharmacology in practice. You have to adopt the strategies to maximize the adherence. And I'm not going to tell you what strategies are to be there, but there are some tools you can use, like serum concentration measures. You can see, especially for the drugs with narrow therapeutic index. If you are not getting a response to an anti-epileptic desire, don't just go into the increase in the dosages. You have to do the first see what is the serum concentration level, and then take your decision. Many times you have to do for the hemoglobin for anemia, or thyroid stimulating hormone for the thyroid disorders, or for if you are giving anticoagulants, then APTT or prothrombin time. And the clinical, don't you have to keep that clinical acumen all things. That look at the blood pressure, look at the if there is a disappearance of edema, if you are treating heart failure, or a decrease in the weight, all the, if you are treating obesity, keep the clinical things also in mind. When to monitor also has a significance and also has a rationale in pharmacology. Why you all have to look at the hemoglobin levels In a patient with anemia 3 weeks later, why not weekly? Or why TSA should be seen only after 1 month and not prematurely after 1 week or 5 days? Yeah, if you are giving antidepressant, why the mood elevation takes 3 weeks to occur? All these things, look at your pharmacology text. Then only you can tell the patient when to come for the next follow-up and what to bring along with. And most importantly, know your patient well. Because it is said, writing the prescription is easy, but to come to understand the people is very hard. And you have to know your patient well to understand what are the reasons for non-adherence, what are the reasons for non-responsiveness, whether the patient has made any errors in taking medicine or using drug delivery system. I was told by our chest physician in our institute that there was a patient who used that inhaler with adrenergic drug. Instead of inhaling, she used it as a room spray because she thought that it has to be sprayed in the air and then she will inhale it. So she didn't know the correct technique of it. And look at the affordability of that particular person. Uh, you should avoid the prescribing cascade. And what is meant by the prescribing cascade? If you see this case, Mr. ABC, 71-year-old, is suffering from osteoarthritis for 5 years. He was taking ibuprofen and he presented with the increased arthritic pain for which the diclofenac, another NSAID, was given. He reported 7 days later complaining heartburn and he was prescribed omeprazole. The doctors changed that diclofenac to tramadol. 2 weeks later, he came with constipation and inquiry he was found to be taking verapamil. And he was advised then to take the bisacodyl. But then after 2 days, he developed griping pain in the abdomen and therefore he was given dicyclopine. Now, what is this? That when there is a pain, the diclofenac was given. Diclofenac causes gastric irritation, so he had a heartburn. So anti-secretory agent is given to decrease the gastric acid. The diclofenac was changed to tramadol. Now there is a constipation. Verapamil has constipation as a side effect. So bisacodyl is given. Bisacodyl causes GI contractions and therefore there is a pain. So he was given a smooth muscle relaxant. This is what is going on that is for one particular symptom you are giving a particular drug because that adverse effect has occurred and that symptom is an adverse effect of the earlier drug. So try to avoid that. Because that patient was having osteoarthritis, maybe ibuprofen was adequate. You may have to go again for the non-pharmacological measures, refer the patient to the physiotherapist. If the patient may not require any drug therapy. So try to avoid this prescribing cascade. And therefore, it is very, very important for that patient becomes your partner. And there should be some informed collaboration. When patient will not understand everything, but patients, you should communicate to the patient the content. You should give them the relevant, organized information in short time. And also that delivery should be simple, jargon-free, that the patient will understand that in that language. And that should be supported by the non-verbal clues. It is very, very essential. And this is again one of the competencies. There are multiple competencies under the communication in pharmacology now. And I'm very happy for that. And I'm just giving you a small, you can use this framework or you can use any other framework for content communication. We call it as a 5R framework. And what are those 5R to be communicated to the patient? Why? The reason. What he has got in a simple language and why this particular drug is prescribed. And when the drug is expected and stress at that time, why it is important to complete the therapy. The regimen, what is written on the paper, the drug name, dose, frequency, but also give the information how to store that drug, how to give the actual therapy, whatever if you have prescribed. Sometimes you will ask him to prepare the drug, like oral rehydration solution. Tell him how to do it, or may write it on the prescription. Risk. I already told you what common and serious adverse reaction risk and what should be done. And revisit instruction. When to come, whether to bring lab report, whether the partner, the sexual partner has to be treated in certain conditions like trichomonas vaginitis, then your husband has to be treated. So inform that. And the most important thing are certain revision statements. And what are those revision statements? Ask the patient whether he has understood what you have said. And he may say yes, yes, and he will nod his head. But that doesn't mean he has understood. So ask him to revise what you have told him or clarify what doubts he has got. And whatever he is missing, you repeat it. You can't expect him to revise everything. You may have spent 10 minutes explaining it. But see to that the important points have been repeated and reassure the patient. And you have to use the simple things that if it is a short-term therapy, you can say that you don't have to worry, you will be all right. But for the diabetes, hypertension, lifelong therapy where it is required, you have to make it very clear by reassuring that follow the advice, the lifestyle modification and the drug therapy advice. And then you will be able to have a good quality of life. That is what you have to tell. It takes hardly 1 or 2 minutes. And all this information you can provide in 4 minutes time. So you can prepare it. We have, in my institute, my students are undergoing this practical in communication for last 2-3 years. And they are doing it quite well. Remember, your instruction have to be clear. It can't be, can you see this cartoon? You can, typical elevator refers to the leg and not to the blood alcohol level. There should not be any miscommunication between you and your patient. And the entire doctor-patient relationship is built on that trust. And lastly, keep your drug knowledge current. Remember, pharmacology is a dynamic science. Every year you will get new drugs. There are new uses of old drugs. You are seeing now in the corona time how the repurposing of the drug is going on. Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and so many other. Remdesivir, it is also a repurposed drug, and so many more. New adverse effects, the drug may get banned. So you may not be that drug which was available 2 years back, that may not be available now. During practice, lowering of the doses take place because the doses which are there earlier when the drug enters the market are from the clinical trial. The revision of the dose may take place later on. And then there could be new information about the mechanism of action. And this happens, I will give you from my career in pharmacology for such a long time, more than 35 years. And I've seen so many drugs, mechanism of action have changed. So you have to have the sources. Now, these sources are at your level. The sources will also go on changing. At your level, it will be textbook. So always read the regularly updated textbook, maybe year or 2 yearly regular. The textbooks which describe pharmacotherapeutics, you can have them also as a reference book. Because if there is a pharmacotherapeutic, in first year you will require principle. But in the third year, phase 3, you will be requiring more about the therapies. And there, the relating that pharmacological part and therapeutics becomes very, very important. So you can use it as a reference book, or you can have the other reference book for clarification. You can, there is a WHO drug information bulletin, you can use that. And our ICMR and Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, they have the guidelines also for certain diseases. You have to be little careful for that because some of the guidelines are old and they are in the state of renewing the guidelines. So you have to see what is given in the textbook and what is there in the guidelines. But now under this National Health System Resource Center, along with Ministry of Health and Welfare government, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, new guidelines are getting developed. And as you will go further, like when we enter the medical course, as you see in this diagram, you are novice. Then you become advanced beginner, maybe when you join our second MBBS. Then you graduate, you are competent because you have undergone all those competency and you have mastered them. But Then you will join maybe for your post-graduation, and when you will pass out, you become proficient. But throughout the life, you have to remain expert. The medicine is something where we are requiring that lifelong learning skills. And therefore, ICMR and this National Virtual Center for Clinical Pharmacology has come out with an online prescribing skills course for interns. And this year it has been made open for the practitioners as well. And by the time you will reach your internship, naturally there will be further revision in this particular course. So do such course. So then you have to see for yourself if you want to become expert and not to remain a mediocre clinician, that how you can challenge yourself. So and decide your targets every time and have your mental modeling for looking for the sources, and your sources will maybe much more than what I have shown you. They will go to the meta-analysis, they will go to different journals. You need not do that at this particular stage. You can rely on your textbooks for this particular text. So just to end, these 10 principles, keep in mind, you can consider them as a 10 commandments. Establish goal of therapy. Every ill doesn't require pill. Prescribe rationally and not fashionably. Integrate drug information with relevant knowledge from other subjects. Safe prescribing at all times. Problems can arise at any stage, so beware of them. Adopt strategies to maximize adherence. Know your patient well, especially avoid prescribing cascade. Informed collaboration is a key, and platform for that is communication, and keep your drug knowledge current. And with this, I thank all of you for patient listening. Let me see what are the questions in the chat box, and uh, someone has asked me that now, what is your take on the new curriculum in pharmacology in present scenario when online courses are going on and we need to complete the scenario? Don't you think it is a mockery and what we are producing? My take on this is not at all. It depends on how sincerely you are teaching and how sincerely you are learning. Remember, in case of medicine, the self-learning which we are trying to teach, this particularly this new curriculum is trying to make you more and more self-reliant. So one has to study for himself or herself, and there are with the online classes, and understand there are many problems are there with the students as well, like our online connectivity. Teachers, for teachers also it is something new. So, but we have to keep our goal that if you want to become a competent physician, you have the competencies in front of you, you have the resources with you. Try to learn as much as possible. Someone has asked that how should one study the pharmacology efficiently? It is not a simple answer to this. Remember, it is a very, very volatile subject. My teacher used to say, he used to say or share on this, like pharmacology है बड़ी बेवफा सुबह पड़ी शाम को खफा. So it is that volatile subject, and as I told you, it is a dynamic thing, keeps on changing every time. The only solution to it is that if you mug everything, that is not possible. Try to understand the principle and try to derive it. Suppose you have understood the mechanism of action of a drug properly, there is every possibility that you can derive the adverse effects based on that mechanism of action. If you have understood what is required in practice in the applied pharmacokinetics, you will only look for this. The textbook will give you lots and lots of information. It is a textbook ultimately. You may not be able to remember each and everything about it. So try to sieve and try to select the information what is needed, as I've told you in this particular class. And You have to talk to each other, talk to your peers. Pharmacology, if you talk, then you can remember it better. If you read it as a textbook all alone, it's all facts which are given one after the another. You will tend to forget. At the end of the day, what should we focus on learning in pharmacology? We have to learn the individual drugs given in the most books. I don't think so. In case of pharmacology, for every chapter, you will see that there is something as a prototype drug. You have to focus mainly on that drug and see relation of the other drug with that particular drug, how they differ with that. They may differ with that. Once you know the prototype drug, many a times you will be able to understand what is how the other drugs are acting. And if they are differing in the mechanism of action, then whether they are differing in the side effects and to what extent, that you have to remember. So you don't have to remember each and every drug. We will see, personally, I feel there are more than 1,500 drugs nowadays in the textbook. But in practice, if you see, any clinician uses 30 to 40 drugs only. So it is the process, the step approach, which I told you, is more important. And there is one competency in pharmacology, which is on the making a list of essential drug list or the P drug list. So you will be doing it. Do that very, very sincerely when you are in pharmacology, because that will give you the idea of how you will, that may be your own P drug list. And those who don't understand what is meant by P is personalized. It is a drug list which you will make, which has which is made based on those efficacy, safety, suitability, and cost on that particular aspect. And then you are 90% of time the condition which you are treating with that particular P drug. Only in few patients it will be different. So you don't have to remember each and everything. There will, I didn't get this. So there will be hyperkalemia by diuretics. It is hypokalemia always by diuretics. The hyperkalemia will occur only with the aldosterone antagonist, and then you have to remember you should not use them with ACE inhibitors, because ACE inhibitors also cause hyperkalemia, but not with the hydrochlorothiazide or furosemide. Can we use antihypertensive and so forth? No, you can't. Antibiotics should not be used as an antihypertensive drug in chronic heart failure concern. And please read chronic heart failure and see why you are going to use the antihypertensive for the chronic heart failure. Unless hypertension is a precipitating cause, you will not use antihypertensive drug in heart failure, and definitely not the antibiotic. Now the drug like ACE inhibitor, it has got both the action. It is an antihypertensive drug also, and it is used in heart failure also. But read from the textbook why it is used as an antihypertensive and why it is used in the heart failure. I have already given you these resources to stay up to date with the recent advancement in the field. Don't try to go for the too much of recent advancement that is not needed. What is told by your teacher, if you are attentive in the class, that is more than enough. You don't have to go for the recent advances when you are in the second MBBS. And I assume most of you are from the second MBBS. So restrict to your textbook, which is a recent one.
Dr. Ege, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are over time, so maybe you can take just one more question.
So okay, and what I will do, if you can send this question, I may send it and you can post it. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Sure.
So I will take one, that is what is the definition of steady state, that when you are going to give the same dose of the drug at a constant time interval, not every amount, whatever you have given, will get eliminated. Some amount will remain. And this is especially by the drug, or some percentage, fixed percentage of that amount which is body will get eliminated, the rest will remain. So when you are repeating the same dose, slowly the drug will start getting accumulated. And a stage will come where whatever you are giving, that percentage is getting eliminated. So your drug level will not now rise, it will remain steady. And that is a definition of the steady state. So for every physician, we want to reach that steady state. We don't want fluctuation in the concentration of the drug, because if there are fluctuation, then there will be your effects will also fluctuate. So try to achieve that steady state. And when that steady state is reached, it depends on the half-life. 4.5 lives are required to reach the steady state. Okay. And thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Rege. Thank you all the participants for attending the session. A certificate of participation and the recording of this session will be shared with you in a few days on email. Thank you once again.